Hello. Can you hear me all right? I'm doing this from my phone at the moment. I'm going to rely on my other guest, the woke sorcerer, to let me know. There she is, letting me know. Maybe I can add you in as well. Joe. Let's see. Hi, Joe. How are you? Can you hear me all right?
I can, but I was muted. Sorry. Hello.
Okay,
yes,
great.
All good here. Thank you. All good.
Wonderful.
I can hear you. You can hear me.
Yes, and I should be any minute where I'll bring my proper. Has anyone else had this experience of coming back to work at universities and your computers take about 5 hours to restart? Is that just me?
I think
It might
that's
just
normal.
yeah. So anyway,
To be
it's
honest.
just restarting at the moment, so I should be able to face
Is
the head on shortly.
technology trying to deplatform and silence us, basically?
Indeed, this is a regular occurrence actually. That the computers want to silence us, and it's been a while, hasn't it? It's been. We were supposed to be back about a month ago, and we just took an extra month off.
Yeah, I think so. Our last one was the end of July, wasn't it, with Ted McCormick?
That's right.
So it's been a good 2 and a bit months. Yep, but that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of academics have been quite busy. There's a lot of people to indoctrinate.
Yeah, exactly. I've got to do that. I've got to do that indoctrination into Marxism when I take annual leave now. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's only so much time, so we need to get our special re-education camp, away day in.
Absolutely.
But as planned, as we had planned last month as well, we've got a really wonderful guest with us, so I might bring him on if that's all right. So let's see, Jonathan. Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Good afternoon.
Hi.
Very nice to see you. Yes. How are you?
Good to be here. I'm good. I'm back in the office. I did at the end of last week. I did 1 in-person lecture and 2 in-person seminars. So there's with generally happy and almost entirely mass students, but everybody I think was happy to be back. Yes, so they're feeling like some semblance of normality here at King's.
That's good.
Great.
Yeah. And it's been, I think I did my first lecture maybe last week, and that it was very interesting to just think about having left my office sort of 18 months ago or 2 years ago without thinking I was going for that long. I'm glad I cleaned my my cups and things before I left. But
I'm still in my bedroom because I'm research staff, so I'm still in my bedroom like I have been. Yeah, but that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah.
Try and get to the British Library or something to get a bit of change or something tomorrow. Who knows?
And now, I had meant to organize this with we were going to be discussing. Is it John Cleese? This was how long ago we were planning to come. Was so the Ministry of Silly Moral Panics. And I have on here sort of the plans to talk about John Cleese waiting to arrive, but I mean by this point that whole joke has kind of come and gone, hasn't it? I mean,
well, hasn't he said anything else bigoted in the meantime though, or silly? I mean, is there not new John Cleese info within that time? Do we know?
Well, it was just that he got commissioned to do this Channel 4 documentary. So he was going to do this Channel 4 documentary on cancel culture. And it just was one of those other examples of kind of how many times do we need to report on this event, but apparently many. So, and I think that was actually one of the major reasons we were interested in discussing this with Jonathan, because this is something you've been, I suppose, maybe following or been a part of for quite a while. And in particular, I have the sense that your discipline, if I could say, as a sociologist, is it political science?
Well, I'm an economist, really.
An economist, but yeah, it
Or
just sort of seems like there's so many people kind of wanting this to be an issue. Is that your experience?
yes, I mean, I think so it's interesting. Economics has a sort of, in some ways, a deservedly bad rap as a discipline, and particularly as a social science, as being sort of thinking it's above thinking. First of all, we have a superiority complex with respect to other social sciences. Second, we are objectively, I think, in terms of gender and race equality or diversity within the profession, we are objectively pretty awful. And related to that, I think there is related but not the same. There is a sort of legitimate set of criticisms of economics as being sort of quite ideologically homogenous, not necessarily in a particularly, or at least what we economists would think of as being in a political way, but we have a particular. Mainstream economics has a particular approach, which is based around, the sort of Econ 101 idea of individual, rational, utility maximizing agents. And I think there's been increasing realization in recent years that in itself has some sort of, that there are some ideological, we like to think of that as being sort of detached, rational, coming from first principles. In practice, of course, there are lots of sort of ideological assumptions embodied in that. And I guess,
sorry.
I think that's you, Eric, giving us feedback somehow.
I think he's coming back.
Yeah, coming back, hopefully without the feedback. I mean, and perhaps one way in which my perspective might, I hope, without being too egotistical, be interesting to some people here, is that, my personal background is very sort of mainstream in a sense. I was a mathematician before I became a civil servant, and then I became an economist when in the civil service at the Treasury. And so my training, my formation was very much in this particular ideological mold. That the Econ 101 mold, which the Treasury tends to work on. And I was a civil servant for a very, very long time. But I think, I left the civil service about 10 years ago. And over that time, my thinking, but also I think, frankly, the thinking of a lot of economists like me, who grew up in this sort of tradition of we've had our ideas challenged, going from the sort of the most obvious and famous example of this is Paul Krugman, who many of you will have read, who has gone from, again, somebody who had a very traditional mathematical model-oriented approach to economics, and won the Nobel Prize on that basis for his trade theories, through to somebody who makes a fairly consistent and not, Krugman is not a Marxist, but is very much a political economy critique of how economics and works in the US in particular, and how some economists, or some economics at least, is distorted in the interests of the of some of the people who've been in power one way or another in the UK, in the US, and by implication the UK over the last half century. So in that sense, as a sort of old white man from a tradition, not old, middle-aged white man from a fairly traditional background, I think for me, a lot of this sort of stuff about the political economy of all of this is relatively new and interesting, and in some respects, I'm still sort of feeling my way.
Yes, well, I mean, I suppose, was it Brexit in particular that kind of brought, because I feel like there's a lot of, one of the things that we explore a lot in this program is the kind of overlapping groups that seem to have this issue with free speech. And they're sort of referring to a lot of things that are not free speech problems as free speech problems. And I would guess that just would you consider that to be the point at which you started to be drawn into these things from what I recall, you were sort of making arguments about various economic consequences of, say, leaving the European Union, and that was then treated as though it was kind of the academy is silencing all of these people.
There's a bit of that. I think for me, it began more with my work on immigration, which dates back a long time to that.
Right.
To the early 2000s. And again, I started off working on immigration very much from through a standard economic labor market approach, doing fairly technical work, albeit with policy implications on the labor market implications of immigration. But the more you work on immigration, the more you get drawn into the history and the politics of the history of immigration and race in the UK. And for a while, I tried to draw this distinction between, talking about immigration and particularly the economics of immigration and talking about race and ethnicity. And over time, it's become, frankly, harder and harder to do that. And you do get drawn into these debates. And I think, again, here, one of the advantages of being, having been around for a while is that you see a lot of these arguments sort of come round again. As you and others have observed, many of the arguments that we're seeing now about, wokeness and free speech and all the rest of it, very much have a lot in common with the discussion about the loony left and so on in local authorities, especially here in London in the 1980s. And you can see some of the same. The sort of I don't know how many of the audience will remember things like the Sun headlines about how Baa Black Sheep was banned in primary schools for being racist, supposedly, and how a children's book called Daisy or whatever has two mommies again was an example of how the loony left were promoting homosexuality to primary school kids. So just as it is in race and immigration, you often you always see parallels to what Enoch Powell was saying 50 years ago or whatever. A lot of these discussions about what is now referred to as wokeness have a lot of parallels with what was described as political correctness 30 years ago. And you have, whether they realize it or not, the same sort of people making the same sort of arguments.
Yeah. And I think we had, at one point, Evan Smith called us from Australia because he's done a lot of the history of that kind of 80s. It really is very identical and almost the same sort of arguments, which makes me kind of think, is this like as because I'm coming from the United States. I've been in the UK for about 10 years now, but it seems like, are we just kind of doomed to just repeat this over and over again, because there seems to be these various issues represented as censorship that are just objectively not the case. And I guess this is a question for me. Are the people making these claims intentionally doing this as a kind of performance of victimhood or something, or do they genuinely feel aggrieved? What do we think?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, are we doomed to do all this? Well, I think the short answer here is yes, we are. Uh, um, um, but the sort of optimistic take on this, and this sort of depends whether I guess you subscribe, and I guess again being a bit old-fashioned, I sort of do, to a sort of vaguely Whig interpretation of history, where things on the whole tend to get better. In other words, that we have these discussions from a some, yes, we are doomed to have these discussions over and over again, but hopefully we have them from a somewhat better place than we were doing 30 years ago, and that some things that were not that were acceptable, some stuff that you could print in the Sun or the Mail, or say in Parliament, indeed 30 years ago, you just couldn't anymore. And so we're having the same type of debate, but we're doing it on terrain that is hopefully a little better. So that's the both the optimistic and the negative, pessimistic spin on it. Why are people doing it? Well, I think what is new, I think, is the sort of the sort of obvious phenomenon that we all know, which I don't think really did exist 30 or 40 years ago. So you have the phenomenon of politicians taking advantage of it to make, as a wedge issue. That isn't new. But this phenomenon of media personalities who you're never quite sure whether they're doing it for money, ideology, or simply fun, or some combination of all three of them, the sort of Lawrence Foxes, Toby Youngs,
right?
Katie Hopkins.
Katie Hopkins. Yeah.
A more extreme example, maybe, but
yes.
Yeah.
So that I think is a bit new, and that has something obviously to do with social media / celebrity culture, right? That this is something that and yes, you have this spectrum from Katie Hopkins through to Lawrence Fox, through to Toby Young, through to Douglas Murray, and all of these people, yes, do they believe it? They do in some sense. Equally, it's also something that they do. It's a career too, right?
Yeah, I think what's interesting to me about Hopkins and Fox, I think to an extent, is that Hopkins had that whole incident with Jack Monroe where she refused to apologise, and so ended up having to sell her house to kind of fund this defamation lawsuit that she lost. And then it's almost like she had to become more and more extreme to kind of keep herself. And you do kind of think to yourself, well, how much do these people actually believe? And now you're at the point where she's banned from Twitter and she's kind of, sort of right in with the far right. And you're thinking, is this just what she's now doing to try and keep her head above water? And I think to an extent, Fox as well, it's like he clearly, what was it we said about him before? It's like he's a sidekick, isn't he? Like in was it Lewis?
Yeah, he's a pretty mediocre actor, isn't he?
Yeah, from a well-known Dynasty.
Dynasty, yeah.
Right, there's this nepotistic kind of, oh well, you go to RADA because you're the son of this Fox or that whatever. And you wonder if he's just, the divorce didn't go very well, did it for him? And it's like, it's almost like, how do I keep myself either relevant or in money? So I think that's quite tragic as well. But also, I don't think it matters if they believe it in a way. I don't know. Does it?
No, well, because the audience is there either way, there to pick up on it. I mean,
yeah. No, I mean, and in some sense, but of course, in some sense, these people, right, are does Katie Hopkins matter? Not very much, probably. The more interesting phenomenon to me is people who is the pages of the Times, the Telegraph, and the Spectator. So going directly to the free speech stuff, I was just reading. Some of you probably will have seen Claire Foge's article today.
Not sure I've seen it. No.
It's about it's about the St Andrews diversity course, which was in the Times a couple of days
St Andrews.
Ago. Yes.
Goodness, that sounds challenging.
Well, so the Times had an article 2 days ago about the supposedly, and I'm not prepared to take anything the Times says on trust on this, but the article, the news report said that St Andrews had introduced a compulsory course on equality and diversity for new students. Yes, you got it there. The course. So the original article quoted. Have you got the actual quoted the course as saying some things which sounded perfectly reasonable and sensible, some things which sounded a bit silly to me personally, but then these courses are never particularly well written, are they?
Yeah.
And so Claire Foges uses as the jumping off point for a frankly unhinged article on how, this course, well, you can see it. I mean, it gets worse really, because it says, what does it say? It says stuff like how this this is going to render university students conformists who are completely unemployable in the real world. And we're literally, of course, as you guys all know, talking about a 90-minute maximum tick box exercise where you are supposed to read some stuff about generic stuff about
like you're supposed to be tolerant of other people and whatnot.
This is just like, please don't be an arsehole 101, isn't it? Like, just, but I think it's quite insulting to students to think that they would just be indoctrinated by this as well, isn't it?
By an hour and a half,
It's completely. Yes. So it's an hour and a half, and I say, some of the, and I said this in an online conversation with David Aronovich. I said, look, this is completely ridiculous, and David Aronovich said, oh no, that you and I would have resented this if we'd had to take it when we were undergraduates. To which my response was, well, yes, but I resented having to do the bloody GDPR online module that King's makes me do.
Yeah. It's like sometimes you just have to do these things.
Yes, because if I didn't, I'd get locked out of my email account. Which so but I may have resented it, but it doesn't mean that I think that King's is somehow corrupting the
it's not like you're gone to the gulag by having to sit through it, which is, I mean, the hyperbole of these things. It's really it seems to be. It seems to be like a kind of why is Claire Foch doing this? It's like the end of conservative politics. It's like this is the only thing they have to say anymore. At this point.
But it's the same article over and over again with these people. I find, and you find it with transphobic columnists as well. It's like, oh, the same thing about toilets, or I don't know, changing rooms, or with these people, it's kowtowing to the woke mob or whatever, and it's like, did you actually write that, or did you just do a bit of a sort of find and replace with that? I don't know.
Well, yeah. So I think it's quite difficult to deal with this, because on the one hand, trying to sort of, one sort of thinks this is about our sector. She's saying some quite, in a high-profile platform, saying some quite damaging things about the sector that we all work in, and we all know that this is just not why any of us come to work in the morning. We want to get on and do our job and help our students and do our research and the rest of it, and you've got this stuff which is damaging. On the other hand, you sort of think, are you just responding to it is presumably what they want? Is it better just to ignore that? And lots of people will say this to you on Twitter, even if you even comment on it, say, why are you commenting? Why are you linking these people? Why are you screenshotting them? You should just ignore them. And I think there's some force to that. And also, on the other hand, it's just so bloody boring, because, as you say, Joe, to the extent there is a point, it's the same point repeated over and over and over and over again.
It is so boring, and I think I can see the argument for kind of saying, oh, well, just let them kind of scream into their echo chamber. But I think in terms of when people are kind of spouting not just collective slander of our sector, but also bigotry, I think it's often people that don't have a stake in that who kind of say, oh, ignore it. And so I think there's kind of arguments both ways on that one, certainly. But it's really tiring and really reactionary, isn't it? It's just, yeah, you're right. It's boring. Have you got nothing better to write about?
Yeah.
You know,
yes. And I really sorry for historians, you know, who, you know, in particular, this stuff which endlessly comes out in the Telegraph or whatever about.
Yes. Hi.
Right.
Hi.
And, you know, I just don't know, whether if I were you, I would have the energy to respond to it all, because it is basically the same thing every time.
I think people purposely misunderstand what the discipline of history is, right? Because it's not just facts. You know, we don't learn facts by looking at statues. But honestly, yeah, it's exhausting. It is exhausting because I'm already exhausted because I'm precariously employed, right? So we're talking about a sector that's largely exhausted, precariously employed, overworked.
And it's kind of like, do we also have to deal with this?
Yeah.
Well, because I think I'm trying to remember who was writing about it. Was it Nicholas Goyat? Maybe about the Cambridge.
Yeah.
There's this Nick Cohen, and he wrote this in 2020, and that Cambridge developed that free speech policy essentially in response to the fact that Gavin Williamson and all these people were making stuff up. And so they needed to put something out, and so they said, well, everyone should respect each other's points of view or whatever. And then sort of like on cue, all of these commentators said, how dare these people are insisting on respect, and we need to replace it with tolerance. Or I can't remember whether it was one or the other, because it's like either of those are fine, really.
Yes, it was hard to really work out what the argument was about.
But there was this like attempt to make it seem like there was, first of all, any group whatsoever that was like insisting on respect and not tolerance, or vice versa, and it was really just this kind of. I increasingly think that there's a combination of things. There's the politicians sort of cynically trying to just have a culture war when they have nothing else to say. And their economic... this is at the point at which, there's petrol stations empty and they're bringing the army in. And this is still considered a concern for people. But put that aside, I think the media have a real... the folks who write these columns and things really disdain academics for really, I don't know why, pointing out that they don't have much substance to what they say or what it is, but they seem to really enjoy going after universities in a way that has to be related to maybe their own education or what it is, but the media does seem to really dislike universities.
They seem to only be a fan of certain people at universities having free speech and speaking out. I think that's obvious to me as well. The way that there is no kind of support for, say, the idea that roads must fall, for example. What about the freedom of people to protest having a statue to someone like Cecil Rhodes, right? Or the way that certain people are silenced on social media and stuff, and it's all about what you say and not your actual right to freedom of speech, isn't it? So that's also quite telling. But I think also it's because someone's been sitting at high table at Cambridge and been told off for using a slur or something, and they don't like that because they're used to sitting at high table and saying what they want, and they're not happy because they're now accountable for actually not speaking in that way. So I think it is a reaction to that too. So there is also that, and I think probably the Me Too stuff probably started off a lot of these conversations as well, about what it is and isn't okay to kind of do, as a in a university setting, right?
Absolutely. And speaking about what's considered allowed within universities, I don't know. One of the things we were going to discuss this morning was GB News, right? So GB, like Andrew Neil left GB News. So here's but this is I don't know if everyone caught this, but this was quite interesting within his, I can't remember which interview it was, but one of the reasons he left was someone at GB News suggested that they needed to put secret cameras on the children and students to videotape. It was sort of like woke watch to an extreme. And, I feel like that is a thing that is not far removed from, for example, Turning Point, UK, and so forth. Like I think it's one of these things that I sort of regularly ask about and why I keep going back to, are they serious? Because the conservatives, I feel like once you put that into their mind that there is this indoctrination happening, it's like maybe they do want to send in secret cameras to, in the same way, if we think that there's child labor laws being broken in Bangladesh, we want to send a secret camera in to catch the crimes or what have you. But the fact that GB News was suggesting to do that is really something.
I mean, I think, again, that sort of reflects the sort of, yes, I mean, but this sort of, your original title for this thing, Moral Panic. Moral Panic's about left-wingers or gay people or whatever it is interfering with our children goes back a very, very long way, right? And has often been the focus of these moral panics historically. So again, there's nothing new here. And of course, we know that if they did indeed put cameras into classrooms, what they would find is a time.
And also, we already have the cameras. I mean, I'm sure they could access Panopticon or whatever it's called. I think most of us are, going through the syllabus. A couple of quotes on this. I think that this idea. So this gets into the question of evidence, which is what we tried to push Eric Kaufman on when we talked to him. There's this kind of idea that there is some evidence that's just not being recorded, and if it were, then we would prove that. But isn't it also just like it's actual kind of witch hunt level? They're like imagining these phantoms that don't actually exist. And that's, I guess, what also similar to a moral panic.
Yes, I mean, Eric, of course, is the other Eric is an interesting example. Since his line is a sort of odd line that, yes, he recognizes that there's not really a sort of any evidence that people who believe in Brexit or whatever are actually being sacked at universities. Because they're not, but that somehow there is a chilling environment, and that people feel that they that they're not, that there's insufficient ideological diversity. Yes, exactly. His iceberg. And that, sorry, I'm going to squint at the screen here.
But at what point are we taking this seriously? 0.03%. But then he wants to say that share of saying leavers are uncomfortable expressing beliefs. Now, that might be true, but that's not my problem, really. I talk to leave people all the time. So if they feel uncomfortable talking to me, it's like, what? I guess we're supposed to invite them to lunch and things to make them feel comfortable.
So this is, this is the point at which it just becomes very fuzzy, and you don't know what they mean. I mean, for what it's worth, at least I happen to work in, because I'm not in an economics department, but rather in a department of political economy. My department is incredibly ideologically heterogeneous in the sense that there are some some people, I think, who come from sort of quite a libertarian economics background, because we have to some extent a tradition of that at King's. And yet at the same time, we've got people on the sort of political theory, political economy who are very left-wing indeed. You've got people like me who come from a sort of a more policy-oriented background, perhaps leftish, but from a different sort of tradition. And yet, of course, departmental meetings are spent mostly complaining, as all departmental meetings almost everywhere are, complaining that the central administration doesn't treat us properly, and that we need fewer students and more lecturers, because otherwise we have to teach too much, and that's what people, so that's, when people have lunch with each other, that tends to be the sort of thing that they talk about. Or maybe
Yes.
Does anyone even have time? Does anyone even have time for lunch now?
No, I mean,
isn't that part of the problem?
And that all of this, all of this,
desk like that.
And all of this has continued during pandemic, when we've all been literally at home, not having lunch with one another.
Yeah.
But I mean, there are these things, and I feel like these studies by people like Kaufman and Goodwin doesn't do his own studies, but sort of platforms anything that would suggest there's a woke conspiracy or whatever. But I feel like it does create this kind of idea. It reinforces the idea that even if there's just a few people saying that this is true, that it sort of reinforces this. We talked at the beginning about there's clearly an audience that wants this to be true, these types of things. So I guess that maybe brings us on to just conspiracies in general. And ultimately, one of the big kind of issues that came up was an actual case of dismissal. That is very complicated, but also kind of points out what are the actual issues going on with academic freedom. And I know Joe might not be able to say very much about this, because I have the sense that there's a kind of issue with UCU and things. Joe's also a member of the UCU, but I'm sure that, like many, this is a very interesting and also tricky case that I know you were talking about as well, Jonathan. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think, and this is where you get to the sort of what really annoys me, and the sort of intellectual dishonesty of some of this sort of clairvoyance. You put up the Nick Cohen article, and if Nick Cohen actually wanted to have a serious debate about this, he could have said where he stood on David Miller,
right?
Because there is, in my
view,
this is
an actual case.
This is an actual case. This is an actual case of somebody who is actually being cancelled, right? Miller is being cancelled.
And then you could say, I do or do not approve of this.
Yeah, he's being cancelled for something which, of course, none of us know the precise facts of the case or the employment law involved. So, I don't want to be too definitive, but it seems reasonably clear that he has been cancelled, or is going to be sacked, for saying things that were not illegal. So in other words, if you have this purist version of academic freedom that says once you're a tenured academic, you should be able to say anything you damn well please, as long as it doesn't actually break the law. So you can't incite racial hatred, because that's against the law. But if you merely express your academic, your view that as an academic, it's your view that the research shows conclusively that Jews are in fact in charge of the world's central banks or whatever it is.
Right.
That's there's nothing illegal about saying that it's your view that Jews run the world. That's not a direct, that doesn't break the law. So if you take that purist view, then academic freedom ought to protect that. It seems to me that that's an argument you can make if you want it. But if you are going to make that, then you have to make it, and not, rather than sort of wittering on, as it were, deal with an actual case that is actually quite a hard case.
Well,
and I think my view is that, but again, this is hard, is that actually there are some things which are legal to say, but
Yeah.
are inconsistent with being with teaching in a UK university.
Yeah.
And without, as I say, without knowing the details of the case, it seems fairly clear to me that Miller crossed that line, and that Bristol has a good case for sacking him. The courts will
Yeah.
decide ultimately.
Well, and I think this comes up against the fact that academic freedom is not the same as free speech, and that as they concluded, the QC said it doesn't constitute unlawful speech. He was allowed to say he's not going to jail because of it.
Yeah.
But you can understand why a university doesn't want someone teaching or representing them on the media or anything else as though they were a University of Bristol academic spouting conspiracy theories and anti-Semitism and so on. And I
in
think
this respect, actually, let me just say a positive word for Eric Kaufman again. Because Eric, in his policy exchange, actually did confront this paper to be a terrible paper in lots of respects. But in his thought experiment, he did actually confront this. He said, "What should we do if a professor undertakes research designed to show that black people are stupid, genetically inferior in an intellectual sense to white people?" And Eric's answer, he actually wrote this down, was, I can understand that black students might be offended. I can understand why any students might be offended personally, but we should, we as academics, we should assume that the professor is proceeding in good faith.
Right.
And that at least is an honest attempt to grapple with the issue. I think it's completely the wrong answer, but at least he's posing the issue in a way that is relevant to the Miller case, for example. That if someone spouts conspiracy theories about Jews controlling the world, then if it, as part of their research, then they should be allowed to do it. That's the Kaufman view. Whether that's the government view is unclear to me.
Well, I think that's what hit when. Was it Michelle Donnellan kind of had a backtrack? Because I think Kaufman and someone like Noam Chomsky, it's like there is an absolutist free speech position.
Yes.
And that's a view that some people might have, but I think those positions don't often enough get represented as extreme kind of like absolutist positions, and that the majority of people actually do have boundaries. And then it's just a question of where does that boundary stand, and very often anti-Semitism is a very clear boundary for historical reasons that lots of people will take that seriously for good reason. But there are tensions, like does that limit the ability for people to talk about Palestine and so forth if they're not allowed? Like, one can make the arguments for Palestinian rights without being anti-Semitic, but it might be a difficult boundary for some. You get associated with people on different platforms or whatever. But still, in this case, David Miller, he seemed to have very clearly been moving farther and farther and farther into this conspiracy over a few years. So he started as a respected political scientist with actually quite a large amount of UKRF funding and so forth. Like, he was a substantial professor. But then, as he investigated this Syria and Palestine and sort of started to make claims that certain things hadn't happened, or like he really was starting to essentially lose the plot a little bit, I think. But even then, I think that Bristol was saying, this is academic freedom. He's doing this research. He's got this network. There's a famous network graph of him showing the links between all of the Jewish organizations. So there is that, but then it's really the point at which he goes after the students that they really seem to intervene. And the student society is saying, we don't feel safe with having to take a class with him. And then he said, these students are racist organs of the Israeli state. And I feel like most people, if you don't have a really absolutist view, would say that's well over the line now.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I feel like that. I don't know why anyone would defend a faculty member doing that to a student group in that way.
Yeah, no, I think that's right.
And I feel like, so, I mean, I think that also captures the fact that we aren't just doing research. We're also teaching their students, and ultimately we're organizations with more than one legal requirement. So sure, we need to protect academic freedom, but there are also these equality laws that require us to, not allow certain kinds of hate speech and so forth in our... And I feel like this case is a clear one of him crossing the line, but I also think it would be useful for people to actually state their position on this case, because, as you said, Kaufman, I think, would probably say he shouldn't have been fired. There's a lot of American academics who seem to have gotten the message that this was that he was fired for just saying. Yeah. But it is. I think it is ultimately the student attack that really.
I think that's probably right, and that's certainly what they will argue in court, if it does indeed get to court. But yes, I mean, I think the American sort of absolutist view of freedom of speech would presumably I think it means that a lot of people in the US come to this from a different place to where we are.
Yeah. And and I don't know if Joe wants to jump back in about now that we're kind of past Miller himself, but I mean, I think I think that this issue of like the behavior versus speech, it's like these seem to be some of the tensions here.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, I just think it's, as a UC rep, it's probably just best if I don't comment on a. There's
no,
nothing,
not on that.
I'm
not
not.
Yeah.
I'm not linked to this at all. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think there's always competing rights or competing responsibilities, I suppose. And I suppose there is a difference between, so if I was a massive homophobe, which I'm not, and I was homophobic and I went into work, I mean, look, I've got obsessive compulsive disorder. I have had so much treatment. Thought crime is not something you can be prosecuted for, because if it was, we'd all be in prison, okay? So I can go and sit in there, I can think homophobic things all day. I can go home, I can go out for dinner with my homophobic friends, and we can all be homophobic. But as long as I don't go into work and start spouting homophobic bullshit, really, there's not really much anybody can do about that. Because, and
it's a free country.
But nobody's obliged to have lunch with me at the same time, because, there is also that thing of, whatever. But ultimately, so, you can't be done for thought crime, and you can't, but also a workplace isn't an appropriate place necessarily to kind of spout those opinions. I mean, obviously in universities, it is about encouraging, debate, discussion, hearing things that you might disagree with. But I think, when Sunday Blake came on and she was talking about how, she was kind of converted, well, she kind of came to be a trans ally by having difficult conversations that she was allowed to kind of have in a classroom situation, that actually made her think, oh, so maybe this is, it kind of brought her around. So it's not that I don't think that there should be places for challenging conversations. I think that it's just, you can't make people feel shitty at work. That's just
like basic workplace rights type of thing, isn't
right?
It?
So, yeah, exactly. And I just don't think it's difficult to separate out and researching and asking difficult questions from literally sitting there and making your colleagues feel unhappy and unsafe, right?
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think it's impossible to have even these difficult conversations, like things like gender critical feminism and so forth. It's like there are debates that are had on those types of issues, like safeguarding in prisons and sports. Those are things that have academic debates, because of course you would want to have. I can picture any ethical philosophy being like, is it fair to have a transgender woman competing in female sports. Like that's just a basic thought experiment, which my experience of philosophy is that there's a lot of them over there, but but I feel like if the interest was genuinely to get to a resolution of those, or even just to say, these are the different sides of this debate, it's complicated, that could be done in a civil way. But I think that there are points at which the line gets crossed where people do start, especially when they turn it on students, but even against colleagues. If you're someone who's saying, these people are, horrible, evil people, and then you have to work with them. That's a tricky spot to put anyone in.
Yeah, and I think it's you never know as well what someone's personal background is either, do you? Not for sure, or what their family members might be going through with these things. And nobody is saying that these questions can't be asked about sport. Of course, it is complicated, right? I think my perspective is that I don't really need any scientific proof that trans women are women. I just think that it's enough for me to see that this is who people are, right? So I don't necessarily need to read out reams of academic papers explaining to me why it's okay to be trans, right?
Yeah, but you're doing medieval history and like I mean, if you were interested, like if it was relevant to your academic subfield, you would probably be expected to read that.
Well, it is relevant to my academic subfield, and plenty of people do actually work on this stuff. Not myself, though. To be fair, not myself.
Yeah.
But absolutely, I think the point is that I don't think anyone's got a problem with this kind of academic kind of workings out of the sport question, or I mean, what annoys me is, as a survivor of the psychiatric system, of course, is that I've been in a mental health ward, and I can tell you the violence comes from staff and the system, male and female. So it does annoy me when these people kind of piggyback onto this. So I do have some personal experience there, but it's like,
sure,
ultimately, it really comes down to then whether you go into your classroom and you refuse to call someone by their name, or you refuse to use their pronouns because you're an arsehole.
Well, that's why I think that this Miller case, well, I shouldn't mention this in the context of Joe or ask her to respond, but I mean, I think in the sense of it is possible to make these controversial academic arguments. Like, academia does protect the space to do that. It's really, it's how does it manage when that crosses the line? How do you start to discipline employees and people who are expected to uphold certain standards? And sometimes that's, having a word with them, and sometimes that's, asking them to attend one of these 90-minute classes that are not very well designed. But it's like, surely there should also be a space for any institution like that, and the government and sports associations, to be able to have kind of conversations about, hey, could you kind of tone it down or something, or can you?
I think this is the hard bit, because I think you can agree that it is, if somebody has a sort of personal belief that trans women are not women because there's no such thing as gender, it's only about biological sex at birth, that is, that's we don't police thought crime, and if a professor of economics happens to think that, well, that's nothing to do, and that's all, and it's all just a matter of them thinking that, or saying it in the pub to their own friends. That is, it's a free country. Equally, I think Joe's point seems to me fairly obvious, that if that then professor just insisted on using the wrong pronoun for a trans woman in their class, that's just, well, it starts off with being bad manners, but then escalates to a hostile environment, and ultimately, if it is to such an extent that it's actually damaging a student, the student's ability to work, then it's something that you have to do about it at a disciplinary level. So that, those two poles seem relatively easy to me. The hard one is sort of the middle one that Eric's raising, which is, most obviously in something like a philosophy class or an ethics class or something, when you start posing thought experiments that are legitimate thought experiments in some contexts, but equally are inevitably about people, right? And to take it away from something emotional like transfer, this classic sort of thought experiments about, do you push somebody off a bridge to save 5 other people, or do you divert the trolley
Right.
do you divert the trolley to save 5 people and kill 1 person? That's a standard philosophy experiment we all think is perfectly acceptable to talk about in class. If I then change it to, well, okay, but suppose that the 5 people are all severely mentally disabled and have a low quality of life. That seems like a legitimate version of the same experiment, but potentially,
but it can start as
it
links to personal.
Uncomfortable for a student who is disabled, who has somebody disabled in their family. You're instantly getting onto these quite difficult territories. Is that legitimate? I don't know the answer to this, but that seems to me that sort of middle ground is the hard bit, which I'm thankful that mostly the subjects I teach allow me to avoid.
Can just steer clear of. And I feel like that's also part of academic freedom, is I just don't want to have anything to do with any of this, but which is I think what a lot of folks have a nice, if they're in certain chemistry subjects or whatever, it's not a concern for them. But I think this has been a really interesting sort of conversation to really point out. I really like your framing of the 2 poles of like there's private kind of beliefs, and then there's sort of when does this start to be something that is unacceptable, and then there's a kind of whole gray area in between. And if you're someone who thinks, I want to take a hard line and say I want a really tolerant environment and a really inclusive environment, and that's what I would like our institution to be, then that gray area kind of looks one way. And if you're someone who's like, I should be allowed to do whatever I want, even if that offends a lot of people, that gray area starts to look like, I don't know, Stasi oppression or whatever.
I think what annoys me, though, is that a lot of these reactionaries who talk about free speech don't like content and trigger warnings either. And they are one thing that we can do to try and mitigate some of these issues, right? Is that we say, if I was teaching Chaucer and I'd say, well, there's a rape scene in this. I mean, absolutely understood that you may need A, B, and C. So trigger and content warnings, they're not perfect, but they are one way in which we can show that we are aware that this is potentially incredibly upsetting material, and that, this is a way of preparing people for that. But they don't like content warnings either. So there's also that. It's quite annoying.
Well, that actually reminds me, there was a case during the past 2 weeks of someone digging up an old case from this is in America, where a professor used the N-word in some kind of a context, but the professor seemed to want to say, I can say this because I'm having a complex conversation, and the students in the class, some of whom were black students, complained. And then they did an investigation, and he stayed in his post. But that was a similar case of, well, what exactly are the positions in this issue? Because
it wasn't necessary to use the word, was it?
Yeah, like he didn't have. Well, he didn't have to do that, and so I would have said, well, maybe you shouldn't have done that. But then it's kind of like, but then he was investigated and then stayed in his job, so. It doesn't sound like a problem for the university to follow up on student complaints when he's done that. But folks on the right were sort of saying this is so outrageous that this person was even investigated, that the investigation was itself harassment of him and his academic freedom.
It's reminiscent of what happened in the series The Chair, if you've seen it yet.
Yes.
Very similar kind of situation.
Well, there's also, and maybe you do get into the psychological aspects of it, which is people doubling down. I mean, did you guys see the video of the SOAS chair using the N-word?
I don't know if I did. No.
The director of SOAS, who's from a very well respected academic of Indian origin, ethnic Indian origin from South Africa, used the N-word in a discussion with students. And in my view, for what it's worth, it seemed to me that it was a stupid and offensive thing to say, and it could have been relatively easily repaired by simply saying, "I'm sorry, I'm from a different culture context, and I apologize. I won't do it again. Let's draw a line under it." But he sort of felt the need to double down and sort of defend his right to do it, and that just struck me as, just sort of not the behavior, not how the vice chancellor or director or whatever.
But 90% of problems in this world wouldn't exist if people just said sorry and humbled themselves. None of us like doing it, do we? None of us, but we do it. Eric's had to do it before, haven't you, Eric? Sometimes we just have to do it and we feel shitty, but it's how we move on, and it's how we improve as people and as imperfect sacks of flesh with too much cortisol and adrenaline inside of us, right? Which is what we all are. So
and a huge amount of the kind of heat of this debate, I think, would be resolved a bit by people not doing this doubling down. And there are some people where you get a sense like, this is beyond universities, but like Graham Linehan he's a horrible sort of transphobe. You seem like the motivation was really someone criticized his it crowd, the IT crowd. And he's like lost his whole marriage and everything, but just by being so angry that anyone told him, hey, could you tone it down or whatever it is. And I feel like that's actually a big challenge for us moving forward. Is so maybe something to think about is how can we tell people to quietly have a word with them and say just
compulsory humility training, 90 minutes.
Yes.
I'm not even joking.
on that note, let's put it in the diary I'll put it in the next motion into Senate or whatever to compulsory humility training. So
I think.
But thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Really appreciate you coming to kick off our new. I don't know if we would call it a new season, but we really appreciate you joining us this academic year. And I would have hoped that this issue would have gone away, but I think you're right that we will be dealing with this for the foreseeable. So I really appreciate your insights on it.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Great. Good to talk to you both.
And
Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a good one.
You too. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
What kind of a world is it? You know what? You can't say what he thinks, is that why?
Huh?